Hello, my name is Michael Parker, and welcome to episode 28 of Antidote. Today, joining us in the studio is Philippe Assouline. He is an expert in international relations and also political psychology. He is a writer, he's a lawyer, you may have seen him on television. He is a peace activist, he's been on Press TV, he's been on Point. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction.
Well, thanks for coming. I saw you a couple of weeks ago when you appeared on the Lip News with Margaret and Elliot, and you said some things that really intrigued me, so I wanted to invite you back so that we could expand on some of these ideas. And at the time, one of the topics that you talked about that day was the assassination of this particular ISIS character. But let's talk about ISIS, because ISIS has achieved like this supervillain status. And they're this somewhat ragtag group of several thousand radicals. But why have they been so successful? Why do we fear them so much, and can we defeat them?
So it's a very good set of questions, an important one. I don't know if you recall, about a year ago, maybe a bit more than a year ago, President Obama referred to ISIS as a JV team, like junior varsity, like he wouldn't take them seriously. Today or yesterday, John Kerry said the main priority of the United States is to destroy ISIS in 1 year. So that either signals that the US completely lacks foresight, which I doubt. They have a lot of intelligence. As many mistakes as they might make, they have a lot of intelligence. Or something's happened in the interim. ISIS, as you said, is a ragtag group in the sense, like geostrategically, ISIS is not a threat, right? They're only succeeding in Syria and Iraq because there's an implosion there and they're being funded by other groups. We are focused on them because they're evil, but there's a lot of evil in the world. Mm-hmm. We're focused on them because they're evil and they choose to project their evil onto our computer and TV screens regularly. And they're basically, this points to something very important that I research, how emotion influences the way we process information. The emotion you're in, the emotional state you're in when you see something is going to affect how you relate to it. And fear gives us tunnel vision. You know, to make a long story short, once the president said the only thing to fear is fear itself, there's a reason for that. Because once you're afraid of something, our bodies are wired to focus only on that thing to the exclusion of all kinds of other things. Bigger threats. For example, Iran, Hezbollah, the wider unrest in the Middle East, issues of instability in Europe, for example, all these things. So using fear has made ISIS something prominent. And I believe Western governments are exploiting that to push certain policies.
I would not disagree with that. And you had made that point on your previous appearance here that you thought that Iran and Hamas presented a much larger threat than does ISIS, yet ISIS gets all of the attention. And certainly when they go around beheading people or destroying antiquities, which are our human heritage, I mean, they are deserving of their status as the villains that they are. However, it just seems to me like if we are talking about a group of people, 30,000, 50,000, whatever it is, who have popped up as a group after 2011, it seems like the United States government would be able to squash something like this. But I mean, listen, this guerrilla warfare, we've not succeeded in that for quite some time. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, shouldn't we be able to beat these guys?
Well, there's reports that the Americans are not bombing training camps, ISIS training camps, which would be a nice way to weaken them. I really think the Western world, led by America now, has an incentive in letting ISIS do some damage, right? Again, ISIS is excellent at showing itself to be scary. If the cameras were focusing on what Iran does, executing gays, executing dissidents, raping them in prison, supporting terrorism, we'd be freaking out about Iran. But the cameras don't do that. They do it about ISIS. So what happens when all our focus is on ISIS? Iran suddenly seems less bad. Giving $150 billion to Iran seems like it might not be so bad if they help us defeat ISIS. Letting Assad continue a genocide. Assad's killed almost 100 times, let's say 50 times more people than ISIS has. Letting him stay in power all of a sudden seems more reasonable, right? Fear, like other emotions, completely skews how we're making our judgment about this. And what you said is right. ISIS has about, according to some reports, 30,000 fighters. They have about a $1 to $2 billion budget a year, which is huge for a terrorist group. But they don't have rockets or missiles. They don't have any sizable tank armaments to speak of. They don't have submarines, they don't have boats, they don't have jet fighters. Iran has all those things. Hezbollah has 100,000 rockets, including missiles, right? But we're focused on ISIS because we see them beheading children And it's normal because of evolution. When you see somebody be beheaded, your body almost wants you to do something about it.
Yes.
What you don't see remains abstract. And that's what either the media is doing unconsciously, skewing our judgment, or it's what Western governments want because it takes pressure off this Iran deal, which I think is a recipe for disaster.
Let's roll back a little bit. I am so glad that you mentioned something because I was going to bring it up if you did not. If we are talking about ISIS being 30,000 folks, Bill Gertz wrote the article that you mentioned. He's a writer for the Washington Times. This article came out, I believe, August 28th. And basically what it was that the Pentagon was not constructing airstrikes against an estimated 60 Islamic State training camps that were turning out about 1,000 people a day. So let's just make sure everybody understands this, because this article blew me away when I saw it, and I didn't see it get hardly any play in the American press. If this is true, we know where 60 training camps throughout Iraq and Syria are, yet we choose not to bomb them because they're claiming collateral damage. Correct me if I'm wrong, there is a lot of collateral damage throughout Syria as it stands. So I don't understand this.
And it's not like the strikes going now are not causing collateral damage. We know that the American airstrikes and the British airstrikes have caused collateral damage already.
Yes.
Some of it might be answering to allies in the region. There's countries in the region that America needs support from, like Turkey, like the Saudis, that might be putting a brake on how much America can do about ISIS. Again, I tend to believe that if America wants something, it gets it, right? Especially with this president. I don't really know what the end game is. It's a bit murky. The Russians are coming into Syria now. That's a reversal of 60 years of American policy. It's very unclear what's going on, but the focus, I mean, I can only repeat it, the focus on ISIS, while not doing as much as they could to defeat ISIS, is suspect and strategically, I believe, unsound. Again, Iran has a budget of $15 billion a year in military budget that we know about. It is financing dissidents or terrorist groups in Gaza. It's taken over Lebanon with Hezbollah. It's financing near genocide, 250,000 dead in Syria. It's destabilized Iraq and killed hundreds of American soldiers there. It's fighting a war against Saudi Arabia in Yemen. It's got weapons transfers and dissidents in Sudan. It's got a presence in South America. Like, this is what it's doing with 15 billion. The Western world's about to give it 150 billion. 50 to 150 billion dollars. So what's the logic there? You defeat one smaller terrorist group by empowering a huge one, or a huge support of terrorist groups. It's like releasing a T-Rex into your living room to catch a rat.
Right. The Iran issue troubles me, and on one hand, I'm trying to understand what Obama was doing, and on one hand, I'm trying to understand that he's trying to engage with these people and speak with these people, yet on the other hand, I can't really argue with what you just said. And shortly after, I guess it was just a couple of weeks ago, the Iranians made that announcement about their additional stockpiles of uranium that they had on hand. So it is...
And they've already started funding terrorist groups in anticipation of more money. There's reports that there's been briefcases full of cash going to Gaza, to Hamas. There's already riots starting in Jerusalem, conveniently taking the focus off of Iran. I don't have any proof of this, but I'm quite certain that Iran has a hand to play in this, given the history, their history of fomenting instability in the region. And it didn't have to be all or nothing. President Obama likes to suggest that if we're not for this deal, then we're for war with Iran. Now, the first thing I want to say about that is that there's been war with Libya, right? We unseated Gaddafi, I don't know why, and destabilized all of Iraq.
Amen, brother.
If that's okay, why is bombing a few sites in Iran not okay? But short of war, why not a better deal? Why not what I wanted, what I was pushing for? Unfortunately, I didn't have enough influence, but a grand bargain with Iran, right? Where you bring Iran back into the family of nations for real. Give them the money. Let them keep somewhat of a nuclear program like it is now with the risk, but get them to commit to changing their behavior. Open embassies again, right? Get them to really take the benefit with an added measure of responsibility. That wasn't done. We're just giving them basically what they want in exchange for very little on the nuclear front without asking of them to change their behavior. That's something I really don't understand. It's very murky, and I can't remember a period of time in my lifetime where what is happening on the international stage is so unclear to the people.
You had mentioned in your previous visit here, you said that you thought that Obama was obsessed with Iran and that Obama ultimately really just wanted out of the Middle East. Explain that a little bit, what you mean by that.
This is what I'm gathering from a lot of evidence and people I've spoken to, and he doesn't really have any qualms about saying it, that he wanted to pull America out. He pulled America out of Iraq very quickly, even though there was a surge in Afghanistan, and that was slowly reversed. His posture now is to let Russia take charge in Syria. He doesn't want Americans going to the Middle East and dying. The problem is there's a right way to do that and there's a wrong way to do that.
Agreed.
So one example. In 2009, the Iranian people rose up against their government. I think the Iranian people are ripe for democracy. They're an educated population. A large part of it is liberal. They don't like their Islamist government, right? They got a taste of the medicine that was imposed on them. And this was an opportunity for America to either covertly or overtly support regime change in Iran. Regime change in Iran would solve a lot of problems.
Agreed.
Instead, it kind of left the protesters to their own devices. A lot of people were killed, and the regime came out of it almost stronger because the people are not willing to face that much bloodshed anymore. So there seems to be a tendency to not want to upset Iran, not want to call Assad on his chemical weapons use, for example. He's using chemical weapons on his own people. Obama made that a red line a couple of years ago. And then it happened and he did nothing about it. Because Assad is basically Iran's little toy in the region. So that's what I meant by he's obsessed with not upsetting Iran because he wanted this deal. I'm still not clear why. And it might be that it's to get out of the Middle East. And he maybe thinks that some kind of a balance between the Sunnis and the Iranians would stabilize the Middle East somehow. But this deal, by giving Iran 10 times the money it has at its disposal, is like dropping an anvil on the scales. It turned the sanctions, a decade of sanctions, into a savings plan for Iran. Right? If I take half your salary for 10 years and I keep it and then give it to you in one go, you'll be better off than if you'd had that salary all along. Right? Because you won't have spent, it'll be savings. So that's what's happening now in a way. And all I can think of, and people I speak to at UCLA, et cetera, think of is that he just wants to cash his chips, get out of the Middle East. But it's never that simple.
It's not that simple at all. And well, let's back to Syria and ISIS. So what do we do now? If we were to allow or take Assad down, then we're left with the power vacuum that we've seen in these other countries. If we take ISIS out and we leave Assad in power, there's got to be some middle ground here. Tell me, what are some solutions that we can do about this situation? Because it is getting worse daily.
Yeah, so this is the very all-important middle ground that nobody speaks of, because the way politics have become polarized, it's either A or B. There's been a solution proposed at least to stem the flow of refugees and to protect people. Because again, I have to put this in graphic terms, but Assad is starving camps of Palestinians and you have children dying of hunger. He's dropping barrel bombs on his own cities and destroying, tearing to pieces his own population. So the first thing, even if you don't want to meddle into the ultimate issue of who runs the country, you might want to stop that. If anything, to stop the flow of refugees into Europe and now America. So one thing that was been proposed is Frederick Seehoff is a professor at, he was a diplomat at the State Department. He's one of the world authorities on Syria. And he's been screaming for years about putting a no-fly zone. The US had instituted no-fly zones in Iraq so that Saddam Hussein couldn't kill the Shiites and the Kurds. Right. They can't fly planes, they can't drop chemical weapons, they can't drop barrel bombs, etc. They're not doing that. Why don't you establish a no-fly zone in part of Syria with refugees at least can feel safe from the sky? You can surround them with forces protecting them. That's one thing. Arming the Peshmergas more, okay? They can fight ISIS and Assad at the same time. The Kurdish forces have established a kind of proto-democratic state in northern Iraq and southern Syria. They're the most closely naturally aligned with the West. The support for them has been tepid, probably because of Turkey. Like, I don't want to make things too complicated, but basically there's a lot of things that could be done short of replacing Assad with somebody else.
Right.
And they're not being done. And again, the focus is being taken away because of propaganda and emotional manipulation.
Okay, so let's step back. You're talking about this no-fly zone. And then I read this morning that Russia is now discussing putting in drones over the country, and that they are talking to us, or we are talking to them in this process they're calling deconfliction, so that we supposedly do not step on each other's toes. I mean, to me, this has all the makings of things going very, very wrong in the near future. Am I wrong?
I hope you're wrong, but I don't think you're wrong. Another word for deconfliction these days seems to be capitulation.
Right.
Look, what happened to our focus on Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Crimea? Mm-hmm. Putin is not a man who is seeking anything else but his own country's interest. Whether that's right or wrong, maybe that's a leader's job. But he's doing it very aggressively. He's threatened by NATO's expansion in Europe. And now it's not talking about having drones. There's already Russian jet fighters in Syria. This is reversing at least 60 years of American policy. The Russians don't have a long track record of stabilizing countries they come into, except by crushing those countries, right? What's the plan? What's the end game? What's the justification here? America just seems to be getting out of the Middle East at any cost. 9/11 taught us a lesson, or should have taught us a lesson, that the Middle East will follow you, right? This world is too small now. It's too intertwined to ignore. And we're always made to focus on the wrong things.
But we did not stabilize Iraq. We did not stabilize Libya. We did not stabilize Egypt. So, I mean, we are as guilty of that as Russia. And I'm not saying that to piss anybody off. I love America, but I am super bummed out over what has happened over the last 15 years. I hate war, but if you're going to have a war, then by God, you got to win it.
Yeah. I think everybody sensible agrees that the Iraq adventure was a debacle. It wasn't really necessary. It didn't deal with Islamism.
But Libya was not necessary either.
I do not understand Libya.
No.
Like, Gaddafi's a terrible man, right?
Of course.
But America's not going to go around and solve everybody's problems for them. The Arab world is led by terrible people. Gaddafi was actually one of the ones reforming.
He was.
At the end. He was getting
weirdly
better.
enough.
He was getting better. And now you have tons of refugees coming from Northern Africa because of the Islamist groups that are going out of the civil war in Libya. True, absolutely, America does destabilize regions, but once they're there, right, once they already have a role, once the world is turning to them to do something, including the Arab world in Syria, then to just leave and let Russia come in, how's that a solution? And I said something last time that I think is important. Whether it's true or not, the message being sent or the message being received by people is that America is suddenly on team Shiite. It's empowering the Shiites against the Sunnis. They're the worst battle they've had in centuries. And it seems, even though that's probably not the case, but it seems if I'm a Sunni young man and I see Sunnis getting slaughtered in a bunch of places by Iran or its proxies, and now America is empowering Iran, what am I to conclude? America is on the side of Iran. And that draws more hostility to America.
You did mention that, and I think it's absolutely true. And yet another unintended consequence of this deal. I have to pause because I'm taking all of this in. So Angela Merkel mentioned this morning, I guess there's going to be a summit on Wednesday, I believe in Brussels, because now as a result of this, I mean, we've got, what do we have, 11 million
refugees at this point, displaced people.
Yeah, displaced people in Syria alone. Now these people are moving up through these countries within the European Union, and some people have said this, and I asked you about it. I mean, this does, in fact, and this, I don't think it's hyperbole, this has the potential to be the undoing of the European Union, because if you've got all of these masses of people going into these countries, then you've got a country like Saudi Arabia offering to give money. You know, we're not going to take anybody, but hey, guess what? We'll build some mosques where you can foment more hate on somebody else's territory. I mean, this is not a good situation.
There's a lot of issues that you're pointing to that are very important that are not being discussed by the media, generally, the exception of this show. One, there's this obvious element of multicultural instability in Europe that it's been facing. Europe has failed to integrate its immigrants. It's taken on very big waves of immigrants from Africa and the Middle East, and there is a very big problem now of having failed to integrate people even born there to second generation foreigners who are now, for example, British or French, right? It's a very tenuous situation. They're trying to wrap their head around it, but there's all these kind of political correctness rules around it. They're going about it in a clumsy way. Mm-hmm. That's number one, okay? Number two is when you have this large an influx of people at one time, you end up having different groups in the countries. It took Europe centuries and centuries of war to come to the conclusion that good fences make good neighbors, and countries that were more or less culturally homogenous and had borders between them were more stable in the long term than countries that had multiple groups. For example, Syria, for example, Iraq, right? Humans are tribal by nature, and they tend to fight each other. Like even Canada has a group of French people and English, and they've been
Yes.
fighting peacefully, but for the most part peacefully, about separation. That's another thing. I think the most alarming about this is that Europe has opened its arms to refugees now, which is a laudable thing. And we should always be sensitive to people who are fleeing for their lives. I mean, I'm the son of refugees myself from the Middle East, okay? I'm not insensitive to it. On the other hand, there's a complete absence of looking at the cause here. The cause is the war in Syria. The war in Syria is about to be made worse, for Sunnis at least, by Western policy of giving money to Iran and empowering Russia now in Syria. And yet, the Western world is about to take all these people, and it's broke. The European Union is broke. It can hardly deal with Greece. It's going to take on people who don't yet have jobs, who don't speak the language, like millions of people. This is a big strain. And what it's doing is coddling the Arab world. The West has taken the habit of taking upon itself all the problems of the Arab world and never holding the Arab world really to account as much as it should be. So I'll give you one example. 1948, the State of Israel was created. The Arab nations attacked Israel. There was a long, dirty battle, and there were a lot of refugees on both sides created. The Jewish refugees went to Israel and they were absorbed. Some money from US Jews, there was a bit of help, and they were absorbed and became citizens. The Palestinian refugees, more or less the same number, were put in camps in the Arab world. And instead of being integrated in those countries, the Arabs kept them in the camps, the Arab countries kept them in the camps to be some kind of a political irritant, breeding extremism, and the Western world said, you know what, we'll take care of them. And now for 67 years, 3 generations, it's the only people on the planet who are still considered refugees, and you have an agency of the UN, funded by the West, that takes care of these entire cities now in these Arab countries instead of integrating them, okay? That's one example. The other example now is Syria. Why are we not pressuring the Arab world, especially if Obama wants to get out of the Middle East, to take care of its own refugees? This is an Arab-on-Arab war. Why is the West expected to, how is it going to solve the problem? How are we ever going to have accountable governments in the Middle East if we shield those governments from accountability? Humans learn by paying for their mistakes. It's that sad, but in the West, in the East, in every culture, we've only progressed once we've made mistakes and had to pay for them. If you don't have to pay for your mistakes, they're not really mistakes.
I want to back up to when we're talking about people assimilating into the cultures that they've migrated into. You know, I agree with what you're saying, but I've also seen in countries, groups, they just don't make the effort to assimilate. And my wife, her family is a refugee like yours, and within the country, my wife is from Australia, and there's groups that they take pride in their nationalistic ways, and they kind of, hey, you know, I'm this or I'm that, and they identify with that more than they identify with the host country that they are now living in. And so you mentioned that people are tribal, and that's true. And so even when it's not supported by a government or by an outside group, people tend to do that anyway. And that's my additional fear about this. Even if with all the best intentions, you know, everybody can take in some of these people. Well, once you take them in, even if they're good people, after having gone through a great deal of hardship, your feelings about things may change.
You're speaking about my own childhood here.
Yeah.
So I still think the onus is on the country that decides to accept people to integrate them. And there's been this fantasy, and I'm sorry if this is offensive, but there's been this fantasy of multiculturalism, which I grew up in. It's very well-intentioned. Canada is probably one of the main exemplars. In fact, I grew up in Canada. Multiculturalism is written into the Canadian Constitution. But what that did is that I grew up in a ghetto. And I grew up as if I weren't really in Canada. Like this little enclave, I have a different accent from people. I have a different accent from everybody, unfortunately. But I have a different accent from the majority. I had different values. I had different habits. I hung out with people from my background, more or less. And you have communities who've been in Canada, in the French part, for 100 years and have still not integrated because of multiculturalism. Now, thankfully, I had values that were perfectly compatible with the West. I grew up being told, work hard, be nice, be good, respect the law, etc. But within every community, you might have a little group that is, especially now, seeing ISIS on the news and the world in chaos and everything changing so fast that they're trying to cling to something that makes them feel secure. And often that's going to be a very rigid form of what they grew up with, their religion. And right now there's a problem specifically with Islamism and political Islam. And the Saudis, as you said, are funding this to export it. So it's not at home, they export it. It's not unlikely that a lot of these refugees have been infiltrated by people who are trying to put Islamists in there, you only need a handful to cause problems, right? And so the Western countries have utterly failed to integrate people. I, as a son of immigrants or refugees with a culture I'm extremely proud of, feel that what the West should be doing is assimilating with respect, with deference for religion and tradition, but assimilating its immigrants. The melting pot is better than multiculturalism. I'm going to say something incendiary here, but I believe it's true. Western societies, in particular Protestant democratic societies, are superior in terms of human rights, in terms of economics, in terms of how they treat people, in terms of individualism. It's not because necessarily they're smarter, it's a process of their history that led up to this, and we could talk about it for ages. But at the present moment, it wasn't true 100 years ago, but right now they're superior, and that's why people are leaving those areas to come here. If people leave those areas to come here, it's because they're looking for something better that exists here. Multiculturalism, a lazy multiculturalism, which is like a hands-off, everything's cool, we're just going to assume everything's going to work out, is destroying the reason they're coming here. And it's, look, in England you have very serious problems now where the majority of Muslims want to be integrated. They are contributing to society, but you have a small group, not small enough unfortunately, but a small group of firebrand zealots who are going on TV and appealing to young people who need a kind of sense of purpose. And these young people never felt part of the society, and it's getting worse. And I think the West now needs to have the courage to stand up for its own values a bit. And I think this is what people don't say enough. Immigrants will be receptive to it. You can be a liberal, respectful of the West and its traditions, and stay true to your own traditions. I'm an example of it, you know? But you got to push back a bit.
I think everything you just said resonates with a lot of people.
I'm going to get into a lot of trouble for saying it.
Maybe not. I think you're hitting on some big truths here. The other thing that bothers me is people have attacked this idea that within this huge moving mass of humanity that is this refugee crisis, that, oh, no, there's not going to be any bad folks in there. I mean, that's just, you're trying to project upon this situation, which seems so incredibly naive to me to think that, you know, all of these people, well, already we've got, I believe, Germany who's saying, hey, listen, we are going to take those people who are fleeing the war or persecution, but we can't take all these people who just want a better economic situation. And then there's another group of people within those groups who are up to no good. So to think that those people do not exist and that they're somehow going to change their mind during this journey to the next place they're going to be is just laughable, not even laughable, because it's infuriating.
But this again points to the problem with multiculturalism. The solution to radical Islam is peaceful Islam. The solution to this minority, it's there for sure. ISIS set up to 4,000. Let's say they're exaggerating, maybe 1,000. You can do a lot of damage with 1,000 people. Sorry.
Sure.
The solution to this minority, that's a problem of Islamists, is the majority of Muslims going to Europe who just want a better life. But the West has to make them feel part of it, not in a lazy, deferential way, do whatever you want and we'll like kind of wish for the best. No, go in there, integrate them, teach them the language, include them, right? Impose certain values on them. Ultimately, if they came there, they want that. I believe that the majority is scared of a minority. And the solution is to integrate the majority so that they can control their minority. And the way you do that is, first of all, give them opportunity, give them an economic future and hope, make them feel a sense of purpose. Respect their culture and traditions, absolutely. Let them pray the way they want, let them believe the way they want. But
hold them accountable,
and impose to a certain extent the majority values.
Yep.
Equality of women, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, respect for Jews and gays, etc. That a minority don't have and the majority doesn't really speak because it's kind of these immigrants. They're sometimes caught in the middle. They don't want to seem like they're betraying. And I spoke about this last time with Elliot. We can support, and Margaret, we can support preachers and imams that are authentically Muslim, but promote an Islam of peace and adherence to Western values. We have not been doing that. We've been empowering the worst voices. And now Obama's like done the ultimate act of empowering the worst ones because Iran is the regime that sent the message to the Middle East that jihad might work. I said a lot of things there, I'm sorry, but
No. I'm listening to all of that.
I'm quite passionate about this subject. I'm going on at length.
But you're right. I mean, not all Islam is indicative of this small minority that scares the majority, which you mentioned. And after your appearance on the Lip News, I was sitting there watching with my wife, and she was like, yeah, she goes, that you mentioned the program within the UK right now where they're trying to reach out to some of these people.
Finally.
And listen, that only makes sense. I mean, we could drop bombs all day, and perhaps we should in some places, like these training camps. However,
to save lives, basically.
However, those people will replace themselves. So you have to replace the mind space.
And you said it. I mean, Saudi Arabia is going to fund 200 or upwards of 200 mosques in Europe. Why is the West not funding its own mosques in the Middle East and Europe? There is an authentic peaceful Islam. Unfortunately, it is now a marginal voice because the Wahhabi Salafist oil-funded one has become so much louder in the last 30 years. But there's a way to promote an Islam of peace and tolerance that we need now strategically.
Philippe, so the question gets back to, and you said it before, listen, these leaders, the West, they're not completely incompetent. So they have foresight, so then why are they not doing this? Why has it taken us to get to this point? Are they going to start doing these things now, or
well,
do they not want this?
The UK said it would, finally. Right. I mean, this should have happened years ago. Blair, actually, after the attacks on, in July 2005, the terrorist attacks in London, Blair spoke about it.
Yeah.
But it didn't happen until now. Cameron is making part of his program to empower preachers who preach an Islam that is compatible with Western values. Why didn't they do it up until now? I think political expediency, political correctness. Politicians now are answering a 24-hour news cycle. They're kind of dealing with whatever's the most
playing to the
right
base,
now. Right,
stoking the fire.
Whatever's more urgent right now. The systems have become very dysfunctional, especially here. I mean, you look at the level of discourse and how it's changed in
it's infantile often.
Yeah, it's a circus at times. So
you said, sorry, I got to interrupt because this is a great point you made to me the last time we talked. You said that, like, when we were growing up, and the difference here is, you know, when we were growing up, you had to read a newspaper. And you read that newspaper, and in this newspaper, there's all these various articles, and if they're truly journalistic, then they're free of, you know, except for the editorial page, they're just reporting the facts. Well, now you can turn on CNN, you can turn on Fox, you can turn on MSNBC, whatever your flavor of political discourse is, so you don't have to hear anybody else's opinion. Right. You know, they invite on a few people that, you know, are there to supposedly offer the opposing opinion, but expand on that, because you pointed that out to me, and I agree.
So you used to open a paper, and if you do open a print paper now, you're going to be confronted with certain news that you don't want to read. It's going to give you some kind of a broad spectrum. It's been curated for you. And when everybody read the paper, everybody was exposed to like a spectrum of at least headlines. Now you go on the internet, you can completely indulge in your cognitive biases. You can completely read only things that confirm to you that you're right.
Right.
And you become entrenched in that position.
Yep.
And if you're active in social media, you know, like it's become like Bloods and Crips.
It's unbelievable.
It's hatred.
Yeah.
People just read what they already want to agree with. Nothing's verified. Anybody can start a blog.